The wedding photograph that would shatter Arjun Malhotra's carefully reconstructed world arrived as a WhatsApp message from his cousin in Delhi at 3 in the morning, showing a group of smiling guests at a lavish ceremony in California, where Rebecca Collins, his wife who had supposedly died in a car crash 3 years earlier, stood laughing beside another man with her hand resting on his chest in the intimate gesture of someone completely alive, completely happy, and completely free from the devastating grief that had consumed every day of Arjun's existence, since he had identified her mangled body in a Chicago morgue and carried her ashes back to Mumbai for final rites that honored a love story he believed had ended in tragedy. The shock of recognition was so complete and disorienting that Arjun initially dismissed the photograph as a cruel coincidence or digital manipulation, perhaps created by someone with malicious intent to torment a widower whose public mourning and dedication to his wife's memory had become legendary within Mumbai's expatriate American community, where couples struggled with the challenges of cross-cultural marriage, but rarely faced the devastating finality that had supposedly claimed Rebecca's life during what should have been a routine visit to her family in Chicago. The investigation that Arjun had commissioned into the circumstances of Rebecca's death had concluded that her rental car had skidded off an icy road during a winter storm, crashed through a guardrail, and caught fire in a remote area where rescue teams had not arrived in time to save her life, though her body had been recovered and identified through dental records that confirmed the tragic end of their 18-month marriage that had begun with such promise and cross-cultural understanding. The grief counseling that had consumed 2 years of Arjun's life had focused on helping him accept the sudden loss of someone who had transformed his perspective on love, family, and the possibilities for building meaningful relationships that honored both American independence and Indian traditions, while creating new forms of partnership that respected individual autonomy within the context of committed marriage and shared life goals. The memorial fund that Arjun had established in Rebecca's honor had provided scholarships for Indian women pursuing journalism careers in America, reflecting her passion for international reporting and cultural bridge building that had brought them together at a professional conference in New York, where their initial conversation about media representation of cross-cultural relationships had evolved into friendship, romance, and ultimately marriage that seemed to validate their shared beliefs about love transcending national boundaries. The annual memorial services that Arjun had organized each year on the anniversary of Rebecca's death had become important rituals for both their families and the international community that had celebrated their wedding as a symbol of successful cultural integration, providing opportunities to honor her memory while maintaining connections between people who had been brought together by their relationship and remained bonded by shared grief over its tragic conclusion. The financial arrangements that had followed Rebecca's death included insurance settlements that Arjun had donated entirely to journalism, education programs, as well as the preservation of their shared apartment exactly as she had left it, with her belongings, photographs, and personal items maintained as a shrine to their love that demonstrated his commitment to keeping her memory alive, despite family pressure to remarry and move forward with his life. The psychological state that Arjun had reached after 3 years of mourning reflected complete emotional investment in preserving Rebecca's memory while building his identity around being her devoted widower who would honor their love through permanent dedication to her values, charitable work, and refusal to consider romantic relationships that might dishonor what he believed had been a perfect marriage, tragically cut short by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The social dynamics that had developed around Arjun's widowhood included respect from colleagues and family members who admired his devotion, while also expressing concern about his refusal to consider remarriage or romantic relationships that might provide companionship and emotional support during his continued adjustment to life without the partner who had given meaning and direction to his personal and professional aspirations. The cultural significance that Rebecca's supposed death had acquired within their community reflected broader questions about the challenges faced by cross-cultural couples and the tragic potential for international marriages to be disrupted by circumstances that separated partners from support networks and familiar environments that could provide protection during crisis situations or emergency medical needs. The discovery that would force Arjun to question every aspect of his understanding of love, loss, and the reliability of official information began with that midnight photograph showing Rebecca very much alive and apparently thriving, in circumstances that suggested her death had been an elaborate deception designed to enable her escape from their marriage and her commitments to building a life that honored both their individual dreams and their shared vision for cross-cultural partnership. The love story that had captivated Mumbai's international community began at the Global Media Summit in Manhattan, where Arjun Malhotra's presentation on technology's impact on traditional Indian journalism had caught the attention of Rebecca Collins, a freelance correspondent whose investigative work on cultural assimilation challenges faced by Indian immigrants in America had earned recognition for its sensitivity and depth of understanding that seemed unusual for someone without personal experience of cross-cultural navigation. The initial conversations between Arjun and Rebecca had focused on professional topics, including media representation of arranged marriages, economic factors influencing immigration patterns, and the role of technology in maintaining cultural connections across international boundaries. But their intellectual compatibility had quickly evolved into personal attraction as they discovered shared values about family loyalty, professional integrity, and the importance of building relationships that honored both individual autonomy and cultural traditions. The courtship that developed over 6 months of international travel, video calls, and carefully planned meetings in neutral locations had been characterized by mutual respect for cultural differences and genuine effort to understand each other's backgrounds, expectations, and concerns about the practical challenges of building a life together despite vast differences in their social environments, family structures, and professional obligations. The wedding celebration that took place in Mumbai had been a carefully orchestrated fusion of American and Indian traditions, with ceremonies that honored both cultures while creating new rituals that reflected their commitment to building a marriage that would serve as a model for other cross-cultural couples seeking to maintain their heritage while embracing the opportunities available through international partnership and shared life goals. The early months of their marriage had seemed to validate their optimistic expectations about cross-cultural compatibility as Rebecca adapted to life in Mumbai with enthusiasm and curiosity, while Arjun embraced American perspectives on gender equality, individual expression, and professional development that enhanced his own growth while strengthening their partnership through mutual learning and cultural exchange. The challenges that gradually emerged in their relationship reflected normal adjustment difficulties faced by all couples learning to share living space and coordinate different lifestyle preferences. But cultural elements added complexity as Rebecca struggled with extended family expectations, social protocols, and the intensity of community involvement that characterized Indian family structures and created obligations that seemed overwhelming to someone accustomed to American independence. The business trips that Rebecca began taking back to America had initially seemed like healthy maintenance of her professional network and family relationships, providing balance between her new life in India and her established connections in the United States that were essential for maintaining her freelance journalism career and ensuring that marriage did not require complete abandonment of her previous identity and professional achievements. The subtle changes in Rebecca's behavior upon returning from these trips had been attributed by Arjun to normal readjustment challenges as she transitioned between cultural environments, but patterns emerged, including increased privacy about her activities, reluctance to discuss specific details about her American projects, and emotional distance that seemed inconsistent with their previous intimacy and communication patterns. The final trip that Rebecca took to Chicago had been planned as a brief visit to handle family business and complete research for an article about Indian American business communities, with departure scheduled for early December and return planned before the end of the year, when they had arranged to host their first wedding anniversary celebration for friends and family who had supported their cross-cultural marriage. The phone call that informed Arjun of Rebecca's death had come from the Chicago Police Department on a frozen Tuesday morning in January, when Detective Alan Brooks had explained that her rental car had been discovered in a ravine where winter conditions had delayed rescue efforts, and emergency responders had found only her body and personal belongings that confirmed her identity through documentation and dental records that left no doubt about the tragic conclusion of what should have been a routine family visit. The grief that consumed Arjun following the official notification of Rebecca's death was compounded by geographical distance from the accident scene, language barriers that complicated communication with American authorities, and cultural differences in funeral procedures that required him to navigate complex legal and logistical arrangements while processing devastating emotional trauma that had transformed their love story into a tragedy. The support that Arjun received from both Indian and American communities reflected genuine sympathy for his loss, while also providing practical assistance for handling international legal requirements, transportation of remains, and coordination of memorial services that would honor Rebecca's memory while helping friends and family begin the healing process that would be necessary for moving forward after such sudden and devastating loss. The investigation that Detective Alan Brooks had conducted into Rebecca Collins's supposed fatal car accident had been routine and cursory, reflecting the apparent straightforwardness of a weather-related traffic fatality that seemed to require no complex analysis or suspicious circumstances that might warrant intensive forensic examination or detailed reconstruction of events leading to the crash that had claimed her life during treacherous winter driving conditions. The physical evidence that had been collected from the accident scene included a burned vehicle that had been identified through registration records, personal belongings that had survived the fire, including Rebecca's passport and jewelry, and human remains that had been positively identified through dental records provided by her Chicago dentist, creating a comprehensive package of documentation that satisfied all legal requirements for death certification and closure of the case. The family dynamics that had complicated the aftermath of Rebecca's supposed death included tensions between her father, David Collins, and Arjun over funeral arrangements, memorial service details, and disposition of her personal belongings that reflected deeper cultural misunderstandings and David's persistent skepticism about his daughter's happiness in her international marriage and his concerns about circumstances surrounding her death. The insurance investigations that had been required for processing Rebecca's life insurance claims had involved verification of the accident details, examination of her recent activities and financial arrangements, and confirmation that her death resulted from accidental causes rather than suicide or other circumstances that might void coverage, ultimately resulting in settlements that Arjun had donated to educational causes rather than using for personal benefit. The psychological impact on Arjun had been devastating and all-consuming, transforming him from an optimistic professional with international ambitions into someone whose life became entirely focused on preserving Rebecca's memory while struggling with survivor guilt, cultural isolation, and the challenge of maintaining connections to American relationships that had been built around their partnership rather than individual friendships. The memorial services that Arjun organized had been elaborate affairs that honored both Rebecca's American heritage and their shared commitment to cross-cultural understanding, with speakers from journalism organizations, cultural exchange programs, and their extended international community providing testimonials about her impact and the significance of their relationship as a symbol of successful cultural integration. The charitable foundation that Arjun established used Rebecca's insurance settlement to provide scholarships for Indian women pursuing journalism careers in America, creating a permanent legacy that reflected her passion for international reporting while also supporting other women who faced similar challenges in navigating cross-cultural professional development and maintaining cultural identity within American media environments. The social isolation that gradually developed around Arjun's prolonged grief reflected both his own withdrawal from activities that reminded him of Rebecca and his friends' discomfort with his intensity of mourning that seemed to exceed normal bereavement patterns and created awkward social dynamics when gatherings became focused on his emotional needs rather than shared enjoyment and mutual support. The professional decline that accompanied Arjun's emotional crisis included decreased productivity, missed opportunities for advancement, and reduced interest in projects that had previously excited him, as his work performance suffered under the weight of depression and his inability to concentrate on anything beyond maintaining Rebecca's memory and honoring their relationship through continued dedication to her values and interests. The family pressure that Arjun experienced from relatives who encouraged remarriage and moving forward with his life created additional stress and conflict, as he resisted suggestions that seemed to dishonor Rebecca's memory, while also struggling with cultural expectations about appropriate mourning periods and the social obligations of young men to marry and establish families that would contribute to extended family structures and community stability. The apartment shrine that Arjun maintained included Rebecca's clothing, personal items, photographs, and belongings, arranged exactly as she had left them, creating a preserved environment that served as both memorial and psychological refuge, where he could feel connected to her presence, while avoiding the reality of permanent loss that required fundamental adjustment to life without a partner who had given meaning to his personal and professional aspirations. The anniversary rituals that Arjun developed included annual trips to Chicago, where he would visit the accident site, place flowers at the location where Rebecca had supposedly died, and spend time with David Collins, despite their cultural tensions and mutual grief that manifested in different ways but reflected shared love for someone whose loss had created permanent changes in both their lives and their understanding of international relationships. The photograph that arrived on Arjun's phone at 3 a.m. Mumbai time had been taken by his cousin Rajesh during a wedding reception in Sacramento, where the Indian-American community had gathered to celebrate what appeared to be a typical cross-cultural marriage between a software engineer and an American marketing executive. But the background figures in the image included someone who bore an unmistakable resemblance to Rebecca Collins, despite her supposed death 3 years earlier. The initial shock of recognition had been so complete that Arjun's rational mind immediately began generating alternative explanations, including mistaken identity, digital manipulation, or psychological projection of his continued grief onto random strangers who happened to share superficial physical characteristics with the woman whose memory had dominated every aspect of his existence since her supposed death in that Chicago car accident. The forensic analysis that Arjun commissioned through a private investigation firm in Delhi included professional facial recognition software, comparison with authenticated photographs from their marriage, and expert evaluation of the image quality and authenticity that confirmed with statistical certainty that the woman in the photograph was indeed Rebecca Collins, alive and apparently thriving in circumstances that suggested deliberate deception rather than mistaken death reports. The verification process that followed included additional investigation through social media analysis, background research on wedding attendees, and coordination with American private investigators who could conduct ground-level verification of Rebecca's current status, while also exploring the circumstances that had enabled her to stage her death and establish a new identity in California without detection by authorities or family members. The psychological crisis that resulted from this discovery forced Arjun to question every aspect of his understanding of their relationship, her character, and the circumstances surrounding her supposed death, while also confronting the possibility that the woman he had loved completely and mourned for 3 years had been capable of inflicting such devastating deception for reasons that remained incomprehensible and unforgivable. The investigation into the original car accident revealed inconsistencies that had been overlooked during the initial investigation, including discrepancies in the timeline, questions about the identification of remains, and evidence suggesting that the crash had been staged using sophisticated techniques that had fooled first responders and investigators who had no reason to suspect deliberate deception rather than routine traffic fatality. The financial analysis of Rebecca's activities during the months before her supposed death revealed systematic preparation for disappearance, including the establishment of new bank accounts, transfer of assets to untraceable locations, and research into identity creation techniques that suggested extensive planning rather than spontaneous decision to abandon her marriage and disappear from her previous life without explanation or consideration for the devastating impact on her husband and families. The contact with David Collins revealed that Rebecca's father had harbored suspicions about the circumstances of his daughter's death, but had been unable to pursue investigation due to lack of evidence and pressure from authorities who viewed the case as closed, though he admitted to continued uncertainty about whether Rebecca had been satisfied with her marriage and life in India during their final conversations. The legal implications of Rebecca's staged death included potential criminal charges for insurance fraud, falsification of documents, and conspiracy to deceive authorities, while also creating complex questions about the validity of their marriage, Arjun's legal status as a widower, and the charitable foundation that had been established using insurance proceeds obtained through fraudulent death claims. The emotional impact on Arjun included not only rage and betrayal, but also profound confusion about how someone could maintain intimate physical and emotional relationships while planning elaborate deception, leading him to question his judgment, memory, and understanding of human nature, while struggling to reconcile his love for Rebecca with growing evidence of her systematic dishonesty and criminal behavior. The cultural implications of the discovery extended beyond personal betrayal to include questions about cross-cultural marriage dynamics, the challenges faced by Western women adapting to Indian family structures, and the potential for cultural differences to create pressures that might motivate extreme responses, including staged death and identity abandonment, rather than honest communication about relationship problems. The reopening of the official investigation required coordination between American and Indian authorities who needed to verify the evidence while also addressing jurisdictional questions about prosecuting crimes that had been committed across international boundaries and involved sophisticated deception that had successfully fooled law enforcement agencies in both countries for extended periods. The confrontation that Arjun had been planning since discovering Rebecca's deception took place at a Starbucks in Sacramento's suburban Roseville district, where private investigators had confirmed her residence under the name Rebecca Morrison, living with a software engineer named Michael Chen, and apparently maintaining a completely new identity that included fabricated employment history, social connections, and personal background that bore no relationship to her previous life as Arjun's wife. The woman who entered the coffee shop bore the same physical features that had captivated Arjun during their first meeting in Manhattan, but her demeanor, clothing style, and confident American presentation seemed to belong to someone completely different from the person who had embraced Indian cultural adaptation and expressed enthusiasm for building their cross-cultural marriage, despite challenges involved in navigating family expectations and social obligations. The recognition that flickered across Rebecca's face when she saw Arjun waiting at a corner table was immediately followed by calculation rather than surprise, suggesting that she had been aware of potential discovery and had prepared psychological defenses for the confrontation that would force her to address the criminal deception that had enabled her escape from their marriage, while inflicting devastating emotional trauma on someone who had loved her completely. The explanation that Rebecca provided for her actions combined claims about feeling trapped by Indian cultural expectations and family pressures, with assertions about discovering fundamental incompatibilities that made their marriage unbearable, despite her previous expressions of happiness and commitment to building their life together, though her justifications seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous emotional revelations. The manipulation tactics that Rebecca employed during their conversation included attempts to blame Arjun for creating conditions that had forced her desperate escape, suggestions that cultural differences had been more problematic than either of them had anticipated, and claims that staging her death had been motivated by desire to protect him from the pain of divorce and cultural shame rather than selfish pursuit of freedom and new relationships. The financial crimes that Rebecca had committed extended beyond insurance fraud to include theft of marital assets, falsification of official documents, and identity theft that had enabled her to establish credit and employment under false pretenses while avoiding detection by authorities who might have been investigating her disappearance or searching for missing persons matching her description and background. The psychological evaluation that would later be conducted revealed personality disorders and antisocial tendencies that explained Rebecca's ability to maintain intimate relationships while systematically planning criminal activities, including her capacity to express love and commitment while researching techniques for staging death and creating new identities that would enable her to abandon previous relationships without accountability. The impact on Michael Chen was devastating, as he struggled to reconcile the woman he had loved for 2 years with the criminal who had built their entire relationship on lies about her identity, background, and availability for authentic emotional connection, leading him to cooperate with investigators while processing his own victimization by someone who had exploited his trust and affection for criminal purposes. The evidence that investigators collected during the confrontation included recorded conversations that documented Rebecca's admissions about staging her death, financial records that revealed her systematic theft of marital assets, and psychological analysis that demonstrated her calculated approach to deception rather than impulsive response to marital difficulties that might have warranted sympathy or understanding. The jurisdictional complications that emerged from the case required coordination between California, Illinois, and federal authorities who needed to determine appropriate charges and prosecution venues for crimes that had been committed across state and international boundaries, while also addressing diplomatic concerns about prosecuting an American citizen for crimes that had victimized an Indian national and involved deception of foreign authorities. The media attention that the case attracted focused international spotlight on the phenomenon of staged death and identity fraud in cross-cultural marriages, highlighting sophisticated techniques that could be employed by individuals seeking to escape relationship obligations while causing devastating emotional damage to spouses and families who were left to process fabricated grief, unanswered questions about their loved ones. The victim impact statement that Arjun prepared documented the comprehensive damage caused by Rebecca's deception, including not only obvious emotional trauma, but also practical consequences of living for 3 years under false assumptions about loss and grief, while building his identity around being a devoted widower who honored his supposedly deceased wife through continued dedication to her memory and values. The criminal prosecution of Rebecca Collins required unprecedented coordination between international legal systems, as her crimes had been committed across multiple jurisdictions and involved sophisticated financial fraud, identity theft, and document falsification that challenged traditional approaches to prosecution when defendants had successfully evaded detection for years while living under completely fabricated identities in different states and countries. The evidence presented during preliminary hearings included digital forensics that revealed Rebecca's extensive research into death staging techniques, financial records documenting systematic theft of marital assets and insurance fraud, and expert testimony about the psychological manipulation required to maintain intimate relationships while planning criminal activities that would destroy the lives of trusting partners and family members. The defense strategy attempted to minimize Rebecca's culpability by emphasizing cultural pressures and alleged emotional abuse that had supposedly driven her to desperate measures, while also questioning the reliability of some evidence and suggesting that her actions were motivated by psychological distress rather than criminal intent to defraud insurance companies and governmental authorities responsible for death, certification, and legal documentation. The testimony that Arjun provided about their marriage and the impact of her supposed death was emotionally devastating but legally essential for establishing the human cost of Rebecca's crimes, while also demonstrating the systematic nature of her deception that had required her to maintain false emotional intimacy for months while planning criminal activities that would enable her escape and transformation. The expert witnesses who testified about domestic manipulation and identity fraud provided crucial context for understanding how Rebecca's crimes fit within broader patterns of predatory behavior that exploited trust and cultural differences to facilitate elaborate deception schemes that caused extensive psychological and financial damage to victims who had no reason to suspect systematic dishonesty from trusted partners. The international cooperation that had been necessary for investigating Rebecca's crimes established important precedents for handling complex cases involving staged death and cross-border identity fraud that exploited differences in legal systems and communication barriers between countries, while also demonstrating effective techniques for coordination between agencies with different jurisdictional authorities and investigative capabilities. The financial recovery efforts focused on reclaiming assets that had been stolen through Rebecca's systematic fraud, though much of the money had been spent or hidden in ways that made complete recovery impossible. Despite intensive investigation by forensic accountants and asset recovery specialists who worked to trace her financial activities across multiple states and banking systems. The psychological evaluation that was conducted as part of the legal proceedings revealed personality disorders that explained Rebecca's ability to compartmentalize her criminal activities while maintaining apparently authentic emotional relationships, including narcissistic and antisocial traits that enabled her to exploit others' trust while feeling justified in her actions and showing no genuine remorse for the devastating impact on victims. The victim advocacy work that emerged from the case included enhanced support services for individuals who had been deceived by partners who staged their deaths or disappeared under false pretenses, providing specialized counseling and legal assistance for navigating the complex emotional and practical challenges associated with discovering that grief and mourning had been based on elaborate criminal deception. The policy changes that resulted from advocacy efforts included enhanced verification procedures for death certificates involving foreign nationals, improved coordination between agencies investigating missing persons and insurance fraud, and strengthened penalties for crimes involving identity theft and document falsification that exploited international marriage arrangements and cultural differences for predatory purposes. The sentencing phase of Rebecca's trial focused on determining appropriate punishment that would reflect both the financial scope of her crimes and the psychological damage she had inflicted on multiple victims, while also considering the international implications of the case and its potential deterrent effect on others who might consider similar criminal activities involving cross-cultural relationship exploitation. Rebecca Collins received 8 years in federal prison, along with substantial restitution requirements and deportation proceedings that would prevent her from returning to India or maintaining contact with victims and their families, reflecting the serious nature of her crimes, while also acknowledging the cooperation she eventually provided with investigations into techniques and resources that had enabled her elaborate deception scheme. The psychological recovery process for Arjun required him to completely rebuild his understanding of love, trust, and personal identity after discovering that his most intimate relationship had been based on systematic deception by someone who had been planning criminal activities even during their wedding ceremony and honeymoon period, when he believed they were establishing the foundation for lifetime partnership built on mutual respect and cultural understanding. The cultural healing that was necessary within Mumbai's international community involved difficult conversations about the vulnerabilities created by cross-cultural marriage arrangements and the potential for sophisticated predators to exploit cultural differences, language barriers, and immigration complexities for criminal purposes that destroyed trust between communities and created suspicion about legitimate international relationships. The relationship between Arjun and David Collins was permanently damaged by revelations about Rebecca's deception, as both men struggled with feelings of guilt about failing to recognize warning signs, while also processing anger about having been manipulated by someone whose criminal planning had extended to exploiting their love and concern for her well-being and happiness. The financial recovery efforts required extensive legal proceedings that continued for years as attorneys worked to reclaim assets that had been stolen through Rebecca's fraud, while also addressing complex questions about the validity of charitable donations that had been made using insurance proceeds obtained through criminal deception of multiple institutions and governmental agencies. The memorial services and charitable activities that had been organized in Rebecca's honor created additional emotional trauma for participants who discovered that their grief and tribute efforts had been based on elaborate lies, leading to community healing processes that addressed collective victimization, while also maintaining support for legitimate causes that had benefited from misdirected donations and memorial funds. The professional impact on Arjun's career included both setbacks related to his emotional crisis and unexpected opportunities that emerged from media attention about his case, as his experience with international fraud and cultural manipulation led to consulting opportunities and advocacy work that provided meaningful direction while helping other potential victims recognize and avoid similar deception schemes. The legal precedents that were established through Rebecca's prosecution influenced how similar cases would be investigated and prosecuted in the future, creating frameworks for international cooperation and enhanced verification procedures that would protect other cross-cultural couples from exploitation by individuals who understood how to manipulate cultural differences, immigration complexities for criminal purposes. The support networks that developed among victims of similar crimes provided ongoing assistance for individuals who had been deceived by partners who staged disappearances or deaths, creating specialized resources that addressed the unique psychological challenges associated with discovering that intimate relationships had been systematically exploited for criminal purposes involving identity fraud and financial theft. The research initiatives that were funded through victim advocacy organizations contributed to enhanced understanding of the psychological profiles and operational methods used by individuals who staged their deaths or created false identities to escape relationship obligations, while also advancing knowledge about effective prevention strategies and therapeutic interventions for victims recovering from systematic deception. The educational programs that were developed to raise awareness about relationship fraud included information about warning signs that might indicate partners were planning disappearances or maintaining false identities, legal resources available to victims of systematic deception, and cultural sensitivity training that helped communities recognize when traditional marriage practices might be exploited by sophisticated criminals. The international cooperation initiatives that were supported by victim advocates included enhanced information sharing between law enforcement agencies investigating identity fraud and staged disappearances, improved protocols for verifying death certificates and missing person reports involving foreign nationals, and strengthened diplomatic cooperation for pursuing criminals who exploited international boundaries to avoid accountability. The ongoing monitoring of criminal networks revealed that Rebecca's techniques were part of larger patterns involving individuals who specialized in exploiting cross-cultural relationships for financial gain, leading to enhanced prevention efforts that address systematic predatory behavior rather than treating individual cases as isolated incidents of relationship fraud or cultural misunderstanding. The establishment of the Cross-Cultural Marriage Protection Foundation 5 years after Rebecca's conviction represented Arjun's transformation from victim to advocate, creating a permanent institution dedicated to supporting individuals and families affected by international relationship fraud, while also funding research and prevention programs that addressed the sophisticated techniques used by criminals to exploit cultural differences and immigration vulnerabilities for predatory purposes. The International Conference on Relationship Fraud and Identity Deception that the Foundation sponsored annually brought together survivors, law enforcement officials, researchers, and policymakers from around the world to share knowledge about criminal techniques while also developing more effective prevention strategies and support services that addressed the unique challenges posed by cross-cultural deception, schemes that exploited trust and cultural unfamiliarity. The research initiatives that the Foundation funded contributed to enhanced understanding of the psychological and cultural factors that made individuals vulnerable to relationship fraud, while also advancing knowledge about effective prevention strategies and therapeutic interventions for victims recovering from discovery that their most trusted relationships had been based on systematic criminal deception designed to facilitate identity theft and financial fraud. The victim support services that the Foundation operated included specialized counseling for individuals affected by staged death and identity fraud, legal assistance for navigating complex international legal proceedings involving multiple jurisdictions, and practical guidance for financial recovery processes that could extend for years after initial discovery of criminal deception and required coordination between agencies in different countries. The educational materials that the Foundation produced provided practical information about recognizing warning signs of potential relationship fraud, while also raising awareness about the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques used by criminals to exploit cultural differences and immigration vulnerabilities for elaborate deception schemes that destroyed families and communities across international boundaries. The policy advocacy that the Foundation undertook included support for enhanced international cooperation in investigating staged disappearances and identity fraud, improved victim protection services that addressed cultural and linguistic barriers, and strengthened penalties for crimes involving exploitation of cross-cultural relationships and immigration processes for criminal purposes that targeted vulnerable individuals seeking legitimate international partnerships. The corporate consulting services that the Foundation provided included risk assessment and fraud prevention training for organizations and institutions that facilitated international marriages or immigration processes, while also supporting legitimate businesses that needed to verify identities and detect potential fraud without creating discriminatory barriers for authentic cross-cultural couples seeking to build legal and healthy relationships. The international cooperation initiatives that the Foundation supported included enhanced intelligence sharing between law enforcement agencies, investigating relationship fraud and identity deception, improved protocols for verifying death certificates and missing person reports involving foreign nationals, and strengthened diplomatic frameworks for pursuing criminals who exploited jurisdictional boundaries to avoid accountability for systematic deception. The psychological treatment protocols that were developed through Foundation research provided specialized approaches for helping individuals recover from relationship fraud, while also addressing the cultural and social factors that could make certain populations vulnerable to exploitation by criminals who understood how to manipulate traditional values and immigration processes for predatory purposes. The technology initiatives that the foundation supported included development of better systems for detecting identity fraud and verifying relationship authenticity, while also providing tools for individuals and investigators to recognize suspicious patterns and verify personal histories that might indicate potential deception or criminal planning involving staged disappearances and false identity creation. The legislative achievements that resulted from the Foundation's advocacy work included enhanced penalties for relationship fraud and identity deception, improved victim compensation programs that addressed international crime scenarios, and strengthened verification requirements for death certificates and insurance claims involving foreign nationals that could prevent similar fraud schemes from succeeding. The community education programs that reached thousands of individuals through cultural organizations and immigration assistance centers provided practical information about recognizing relationship fraud, while also reducing stigma associated with victimization and encouraging reporting of suspicious activities that might indicate systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations seeking legitimate international marriage or immigration opportunities. 10 years after discovering that Rebecca Collins had staged her death to escape their marriage while stealing their shared assets and destroying his capacity to trust authentic love, Arjun Malhotra reflected on the personal transformation that had occurred through his pursuit of justice and advocacy work that had protected hundreds of other vulnerable individuals from similar exploitation by sophisticated criminals who understood how to manipulate cultural differences and immigration complexities for predatory purposes. The psychological research that had grown out of his case continued to advance understanding of how cross-cultural relationships could be exploited for criminal purposes, while also contributing to enhanced knowledge about effective therapeutic interventions and prevention strategies that helped both potential victims recognize dangerous situations and survivors rebuild their capacity for trust and authentic emotional connection after experiencing fundamental betrayal. The international law enforcement cooperation that had been essential for investigating Rebecca's crimes had evolved into permanent frameworks for combating relationship fraud and identity deception, with specialized units in multiple countries sharing intelligence and coordinating operations that had disrupted numerous criminal networks while establishing protocols for protecting vulnerable individuals from systematic exploitation and manipulation. The victim support services that had been enhanced in response to his advocacy continued to provide specialized assistance for individuals affected by relationship fraud and staged disappearances, while also contributing to improved understanding of effective support systems that helped survivors navigate complex legal proceedings and emotional recovery processes that could extend for years after initial discovery of criminal deception. The educational impact of Arjun's story extended far beyond formal prevention programs to include widespread public awareness about the sophisticated nature of modern relationship fraud and the importance of maintaining appropriate verification procedures even within trusted, intimate relationships that might seem immune to criminal exploitation, helping potential victims recognize warning signs before devastating deception could destroy their lives. The policy changes that his advocacy had helped achieve continued to influence law enforcement procedures and victim protection measures, while also establishing legal precedents for prosecuting complex fraud cases involving international elements and providing compensation for individuals who had suffered extensive emotional and financial damage through systematic criminal deception that exploited cultural trust and immigration vulnerabilities. The technological solutions that had been developed in response to his case continued to provide enhanced fraud detection and prevention capabilities, while also supporting legitimate relationship verification needs for individuals and institutions that needed to balance security concerns with respect for cultural diversity and authentic international marriage arrangements that deserved protection rather than suspicion. The corporate partnerships that the Foundation had established continued to produce innovative approaches to fraud prevention and victim support, while also providing resources for organizations that worked with international couples, needed tools for recognizing potential exploitation without creating discriminatory barriers that would harm legitimate relationships and cultural exchange opportunities. The international cooperation agreements that had been negotiated as a result of his case continued to facilitate beneficial collaboration between law enforcement agencies, while also supporting diplomatic relationships that balanced national sovereignty with international justice and victim protection in cases involving sophisticated transnational crimes that exploited cultural differences and immigration processes. The ongoing monitoring of criminal networks revealed that while specific individuals like Rebecca had been successfully prosecuted, similar criminal enterprises continued to evolve and adapt their techniques to exploit new technologies and social platforms, while also incorporating traditional methods that remain difficult for conventional law enforcement to detect and counter effectively. The psychological treatment protocols that had been developed through Foundation research continued to provide specialized approaches for helping individuals recover from relationship fraud, while also addressing the unique challenges faced by communities whose cultural traditions and marriage practices had been exploited for criminal purposes, requiring culturally sensitive therapeutic approaches that honored traditional values while providing protection. The memorial garden that was planted in honor of all victims of cross-cultural relationship fraud at Mumbai's International Community Center serves as a peaceful space for reflection and healing, while also providing a venue for Mumbai's educational events about fraud prevention and victim support that continue to raise awareness about the ongoing need for vigilance in protecting vulnerable individuals from sophisticated predators. 15 years after Arjun Malhotra believed his American wife had died in a car crash, only to discover that she had staged her death to escape their marriage and pursue a new life under a false identity, his story continues to serve as both a cautionary tale about the sophisticated nature of modern relationship fraud and an inspiring example of how personal tragedy can be transformed into meaningful advocacy that protects other vulnerable individuals from similar exploitation by criminals who understand how to manipulate cultural differences and emotional trust. The Cross-Cultural Marriage Protection Foundation has become an internationally recognized institution that has directly assisted over 800 families, while also funding research and policy initiatives that have contributed to systematic improvements in fraud prevention, victim protection, and international law enforcement cooperation across multiple countries and cultural contexts that facilitate legitimate cross-cultural relationships while detecting criminal exploitation. The legislative changes that his advocacy helped achieve have been adopted across numerous jurisdictions and have contributed to more effective prosecution of relationship fraud and identity deception, while also providing enhanced resources for victims and their families who need support navigating complex